Good morning, folks. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Just taking a moment to get everybody logged in here. Okay, all right, well, welcome back. We're going to begin covering chapter 12 today, which is kind of exciting because, we're really reaching that last 1/3 of our semester together. I know it's very difficult to keep your energy level up, right? We're getting tired. We've been at this a long time. So, do your best to take care of yourself, give yourself rest, give yourself breaks, get some exercise when you can, so that you can have a strong finish to the semester, okay? It's important that you take care of yourself. Okay, so let's see, we're looking at our schedule here. You know that this coming Tuesday, November 16th, you do have lecture exam 2. Lecture exam 2 will be on chapters 5, 6, 9, and 10. Okay. And of course, the study guides have been posted on Wiley Plus, so the study guide is available to you. So next Tuesday, what I would ask you to do is at 8 a.m., please log in to classmarker.com and take your second lecture exam. Okay, you're going to have 1 hour and 25 minutes to take it. So that means, if you use all the time up, you would be finishing around 9:25 a.m. in the morning. And because we also have lab, right? It's difficult. You got to go from an exam into lab. Let's take a little bit more of a break on Tuesday. So lab on Tuesday, putting this into the chat window, lab this coming Tuesday will start at 9:45 a.m. Okay, because of the exam. So lab this coming Tuesday will start at 9:45. Give you folks a 20-minute break to recover and get a little snack or something like that. Okay. All right. So Tuesday, 8 a.m. Please log into classmarker.com and give it your all. Okay. 9:45 on Tuesday, we'll log in together for lab time. All right. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask right now about the schedule? Or do you have any content questions on concepts or ideas or topics that you're studying for exam 2? Is there anything you would like to ask?
Dr. Allen.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question in concern to question 5 on the study guide.
Okay.
When you say cellular anatomy, can you just clarify that for me?
Okay. Russell, can you please read the entire question for everybody's benefit?
Yes, it just says you will be asked multiple questions on the anatomy and physiology that takes place at the neuromuscular junction.
Okay.
The anatomy, including cellular anatomy, as well as physiological processes that occur when a neuron stimulates muscle cell.
Okay, absolutely, Russell. So what I'm suggesting with cellular anatomy is that for you to understand how a neuron stimulates a muscle cell, you need to know some of the anatomy of what's inside a neuron. So remember, I'll reference this for you in the last chapter that we talked about here, chapter 10. Let me get you a figure number here. For example, figure 10.9. Figure 10.9 is the neuromuscular junction. And so you would definitely want to know what a synaptic vesicle is, right? A synaptic vesicle is a tiny little lipid bubble containing neurotransmitter, specifically acetylcholine, that's inside the neuron. So that's an example of cellular anatomy, that you know what a synaptic vesicle is. Additionally, Since this is all tied together to muscle physiology, you're going to need to understand what's inside a muscle fiber. So you're going to want to understand what myofibrils are. You're going to want to understand what sarcoplasmic reticulum is. You're going to understand what a sarcomere is. So these pieces of anatomy that you find literally inside a cell is what I mean by cellular anatomy.
Sounds good. I appreciate that.
Okay, sure. Thanks for asking. Other questions? Sure. Now's your chance, folks. Is there anything at all that you would like some support on? Okay, sounds like everything's pretty quiet out there in the jungle. So if there's no questions, we'll get started with the next chapter. Please understand that I will continue to have office hours today. I will have office hours next Monday, the day before your exam. So if you need some help with something, you can pop in and chat with me. I'll also be monitoring email. If there's something you want clarification on, shoot me an email. And as long as it's not like Monday evening at 11 o'clock at night, there's a good chance that I will respond to you, okay? Okay, so folks, let's get started in chapter 12, okay? Chapter 12 is the first of 3 chapters of the nervous system, okay? And if you look at the syllabus, we're going to be, the bottom 1/3 of our semester together, we're going to be covering chapters 12, 15, and 16. Like most typical chapters in the A&P text, they are dense with information, dense with content. It's a lot to wade through. But I am choosing to give 3 lecture periods to chapter 12, 2 lecture periods to chapter 15, 2 lecture periods to chapter 16, and then boom, the semester's over. We're done, and we move into the final exam period, right? So we have 7 lectures and counting today left. 7, folks, that's it, okay? Think about that. Okay, let's see what we can do here. I know you are somewhat preoccupied preparing for the lecture exam. That's understandable, I get that. So let's just take some good notes today. You can tuck them away and come back to them later when you have the luxury of more time, okay? So we're gonna get started here. Okay. All right, so chapter 12 is nervous tissue. In my textbook, that begins on page 419. It might be a little different in the digital edition. But what I'm going to start with right away is talking a little bit about figure 12.1. Figure 12.1 gives you an overview of the nervous system and organizational perspective of how to think about the nervous system and its various subparts. And I think this is a really good way to start the chapter. And I want to get some of this language of figure 12.1 into your notes. Okay, so we'll start here. Organizational overview of the nervous system. Figure 12.1. Okay, so when we, as I said in lab, and as I was showing you in visible body, right? When you talk about the nervous system, the first thing that we can talk about is breaking it down into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So we will start here. This is at the top. You have nervous system at the top of the pyramid. And as we come down, we're going to organize additional information from that starting point. So the nervous system's at the top. What's underneath? Central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, okay? As we said before, the central nervous system is made of the brain and spinal cord. That's an easy to understand starting position, right? Because you all know what the brain and spinal cord is. The next major subdivision of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. Okay, it's the peripheral nervous system that's going to have many subparts that we have to specialize in and put notes in, right? So we start with the nervous system at the top of our pyramid. We come down to the next layer that's broken into two: central nervous system on the left, peripheral nervous system on the right. And then underneath the peripheral nervous system, there's going to be another complicated hierarchy of things we need to talk about. So the peripheral nervous system refers to all the nervous system tissue located outside of the brain and spinal cord, located outside of the central nervous system. Okay, the peripheral nervous system can be subdivided into two subparts. So in our pyramid, we're underneath the peripheral nervous system and we're breaking that down into subcategories. The peripheral nervous system can be divided into the sensory and motor divisions. So two subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system. They are sensory, the sensory division. Sensory, you might remember a word that we introduced you to at the beginning of the semester. I don't know if you remember, a long time ago, we were talking about homeostasis, and I used this little story about you walking outside in the winter time to get your mail without a jacket on, and your nerve endings in your skin detected a change in body temperature and reported that information into your nervous system so that your brain would tell your muscles to contract and shiver and produce heat to warm you up. Okay. There was a special word when we talked about the direction of communication of information. Okay. So sensory neurons, let's say at the surface of your fingertips or toes, surface of your body, right? They're going to send information into the central nervous system. So another word for the sensory division is the afferent division. Okay, the sensory or afferent division of the peripheral nervous system uses sensory receptors to deliver information into the central nervous system. Okay. Let's see here. A good example of the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system would include our taste buds on our tongue. Okay. Now, taste buds are part of the anatomy in lab that you're going to be responsible for lab exam 3. So this is, I think, a reasonable example here, right? So the taste buds on the surface of your tongue, they contain neurons which detect molecules in the food that you're placing in your mouth, and they send that information via electrical signals, nerve impulses, to your brain. And your brain, the neurons in your brain process that stimulation, that information, and say, oh, you're eating candy, or oh, you're eating a pretzel and I can detect the salt, right? So that's one example of a sensory neuron and a piece of anatomy that's part of the peripheral nervous system, a taste bud. Okay. Taste buds on your tongue contain neurons which detect molecules in your food. When the neuron detects a molecule in your food, that will lead to the creation of an electrical signal that's sent into the brain. Okay, so the detection of the food molecule literally causes the neuron to fire an electrical signal. This triggers the generation of an electrical signal that transmits into the brain, where your brain processes the information and you perceive the sensation of the food. That's salt, that's sweet, that's bitter, whatever the sensation might be. Okay, so taste buds and the neurons that are associated with the taste buds on the tongue would be example of a sensory receptor that's part of the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, please stop me with questions along the way if you have them, folks. Okay, the second subdivision of the peripheral nervous system is the motor division. The motor division, typically, basically the motor division is going to be the neurons that innervate our skeletal muscle tissue or smooth muscle tissue of our internal organs like the urinary bladder. So the brain has received some kind of information, such as you're walking outside, you step on a tack with your bare foot and you go, ouch, right? That hurt. So what do, right? You pull your foot off the tack. If you pull your foot off the tack really fast because it really hurt, that's going to be a response that comes off your spinal cord, because your spinal cord is responsible for your reflexes, not your brain, right? Your spinal cord is responsible for the reflexes, not your brain. So in the cases of physical insults that could potentially harm your body, such as stepping on a tack, placing your hand on a hot stove, you're going to pull that away very rapidly, right? That's going to be a decision that's automatically made in the spinal cord to accelerate how fast you remove your body from that harmful stimulation. At any rate, the motor division is also known as the efferent division. Okay. The efferent division uses neurons to transmit information from the central nervous system out to an effector. Okay, that effector is going to typically be a muscle, skeletal muscle. It could be a gland, could be the adrenal gland to release adrenaline, right? Epinephrine, because you're engaging the fight or flight response. Somebody's scaring you at Halloween and you just want to run away, okay? Excuse me. All right, so the motor division uses neurons to transmit information from the central nervous system to an effector. Okay, effectors include muscles. Okay, so skeletal muscles to move the bones of your skeleton so you can run away, or could be like I said, it could be an internal muscle of the urinary bladder or something like this. Includes muscles or glands to release a hormone. Okay. All right. So let's see here. An example of this. So let me underline the examples here so there's a little bit of logic to your notes. Okay, an example of this would be the neuromuscular junction, right? We just covered that in chapter 10. So the neuromuscular junction is made of an axon, and information from the brain is spreading down that axon to trigger a muscle contraction in a piece of skeletal muscle tissue so you can lift your leg up, or you can bend your torso, or whatever it might be, right? So the neuromuscular junction is a beautiful example of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, right? The neuron that's part of the neuromuscular junction is a motor neuron because it is innervating a muscle fiber to contract. Okay. The neuron that connects with a muscle fiber at the neuromuscular junction is receiving instructions from the brain to stimulate muscle contraction. Okay. Once again, I want to highlight that word from, right? The neuron that's part of the neuromuscular junction is receiving instructions from the brain, okay? So let me ask you a question in the chat window, okay? Because we've done a little bit of anatomy at this point in lab, all right? And so I'll make it a simple question where there's two alternatives for you to guess, okay? Here we go. Do you suspect the region of the brain ordering your skeletal muscle to contract is the precentral or postcentral gyrus? Do you remember that conversation? I know it's been a little bit. Do you remember it? Precentral or postcentral gyrus? Okay. All right. So Sierra's quick draw McGraw here today, and I happen to agree with her. So thanks everybody that's writing down precentral gyrus. That's exactly right, right? Precentral gyrus contains your primary motor cortex. The neurons in that section of your brain are going to be heavily involved in eliciting orders, eliciting instructions to your nervous system in the periphery of your body to contract skeletal muscles to then move your body. Okay. All right. Good job, folks. Okay. Let's continue here. Now, the motor division of the peripheral nervous system is itself broken down into subcategories. Okay. So I want to continue this way. There's additional subtypes here. Okay. The subtypes are the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Okay. So hold on a second here. Two subtypes. All right. Two subdivisions. That would be a better word. Okay. All right. So as I said, somatic and autonomic nervous systems. So we'll do this. All right. The somatic nervous system. Okay. The somatic nervous system is that piece of the motor division, which is itself a piece of the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system is that piece of the motor division which conveys information from the central nervous system to your skeletal muscles. Okay. Okay, so that's kind of the scenario we've been most commonly talking about here, is really the anatomy of the somatic nervous system, which is a division of the motor division, which is a division of the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now you also have the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is going to be responsible for conveying information from the central nervous system to smooth muscle. Okay, so that smooth muscle could be inside the wall of an artery, could be cardiac muscle, so your heart, and also your glands. Okay, so if it's skeletal muscle, it's going to be the somatic nervous system, which is a subdivision of the motor division, which is a subdivision of the peripheral nervous system. It just takes a while to organize this in your mind and think about it. It will come with time. The autonomic nervous system conveys information from the central nervous system to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Okay, so if you're talking about your adrenal glands releasing adrenaline to pump you up for fight or flight, then that means those neurons are part of the autonomic subdivision of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now, believe it or not, things are going to get crazy here. Okay. Believe it or not, the autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into subcategories. The autonomic nervous system is divided into 3 subtypes. Okay. All right. So the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system. We're going to list these out in your notes at this time. All right, so let's take the sympathetic first. The sympathetic nervous system is going to include those neurons which stimulate their effector, which is to say something like a neuron that's embedded in the wall of your heart and accelerates your heart rate when you get scared or something like that. Okay, so sympathetic nervous system anatomy will stimulate the target organ. It will stimulate the effector. Neurons generally stimulate their effectors. Okay, so an example here would be increasing your heart rate in response to a threat. This is what you traditionally think of with fight or flight responses. And fight or flight is something that, if your high school experience was anything like mine, typically fight or flight was something that was talked about in a standard health class in high school. Okay, so sympathetic nervous system anatomy will stimulate the target organ, will stimulate the effector. The sympathetic nervous system is a subpart of the autonomic nervous system, which itself is a subpart of the motor division, which is itself a subpart of the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is a major branch of the entire nervous system. Okay. All right. So parasympathetic is going to do generally the opposite of the sympathetic. Generally with parasympathetic, the neurons are going to calm their effector. It's going to slow their behavior down, slow their metabolism down. Parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, neurons generally calm their effectors. Okay. So an example of this would be when you've had a long day, you've been studying A&P for hours and you're tired. You go to bed, you lay down, and your body starts to slow down. You start to relax so that you're able to fall asleep. Okay, slowing the heart rate down, slowing the breathing rate down, all of that's going to be achieved by parasympathetic neurons slowing your body's rhythm down so that you can fall asleep. Okay. All right. So let's see, let's get this in your notes. Slow your heart rate to fall asleep. Okay. Also, we're coming up very soon with Thanksgiving. And so traditionally people overeat a little bit on Thanksgiving Day. You know, it is a blessing that we have the luxury of overeating because not everyone has access to food every day, right? If you think about this in a global perspective. What I'm saying is we overeat, and then what happens? You overeat, you stumble onto the sofa, and you get sleepy, then your body wants to take a nap, okay? This is the rest and digest kind of response to overeating. Rest and digest, okay? So I think those phrases, fight or flight and rest and digest are pretty good trigger phrases to understand what the sympathetic nervous system anatomy achieves and what the parasympathetic nervous system anatomy achieves, right? If you're going to get excited, that's going to be neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. If you're going to get tired, sleepy, you're going to rest, calm, slow yourself down, that's parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, there is a third subtype of the autonomic nervous system, which frankly, we don't understand too much about at this time. I mean, we know it exists and people are studying it, but there's still a lot of mystery about exactly what it does. It is called the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system includes those neurons that are located in the walls of your GI tract. Okay, made of neurons embedded in the walls of your GI, meaning gastrointestinal tract anatomy. Okay. All right. So obviously the purpose of this nervous system anatomy in the walls of your GI tract is to coordinate and regulate the process of digesting your food. Okay, without a doubt, it's here where I got to bring in a little bit of microbiology. Without a doubt, you appreciate that our body is the home of, well, if I'm being honest, trillions of microorganismal cells that live on the surface of our body and inside our internal organs and body spaces, right? You have all kinds of E. coli bacterium and things in your large intestine. Our body is loaded up with a variety of microorganisms. And so the microorganisms that live in our gut, and for lack of a better term, the GI tract at this time, they're interacting with the food molecules that we're consuming, and those microorganisms produce molecules that have the ability to activate or suppress neuronal activity. Okay, so certainly the whole process of digestion is influenced by the microorganisms interacting with the nervous system anatomy in the gut. Okay. And these interactions and those things that are favorable interactions, perhaps harmful interactions, are things that we're still really trying to wrestle with from a scientific perspective, still trying to figure these things out. Okay. Okay, hold on a sec. Okay, Faylin, I see your comment to me. I understand, no problem. Welcome to class. Okay. So, all right, folks, there you have it. This is the overview of the nervous system. Okay, so at the top of our pyramid, we have the nervous system. We break it down into central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. And then everything that's not the brain and spinal cord is the peripheral nervous system. Okay, within the peripheral nervous system, you have the sensory division and the motor division. The motor division is broken down into subcategories, which include the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into the sympathetic branch, the parasympathetic branch, and the enteric branch. Okay. So, as you get ready to study this after you get past your lecture exam, it'll be good to review this, to reread it, and maybe even make yourself a little diagram in your notes during your study time so you see the hierarchical relationship of these things. Folks, do you have any questions right now? Okay, let's continue. All right, so at this point, we're going to turn the page in your textbook, and I'm going to start defining some basic terminology that will be useful for you to understand this chapter. I suppose I'm close enough to the next page that I should probably just jump to the next page. All right, so first off, let's define what a neuron is. A neuron is a cell of the nervous system that is capable of creating electrical signals, and generally speaking, with some possible exceptions, does not reproduce in the adult body. Okay, a cell of the nervous system that can create electrical signals. You've seen that for yourself in chapter 10. We talked about the electrical signal coming down the axon of a neuromuscular junction. We haven't explained all the nitty-gritty details of that signal yet. We will do so in this chapter. A cell of the nervous system that can create electrical signals and does not generally reproduce in the adult body. Okay. Folks, let me ask you a question in the chat window here. Okay, think about the context of our conversation. We're talking about nervous system. So here's my question. How would you define the word stroke? How would you define the word stroke? I mean, everybody knows that stroke is a really bad thing. You don't want to have a stroke. And if you are having a stroke, you're hoping that somebody assists you very quickly, because if you get medical care quickly, you can limit the after effects of the stroke. Okay, how would you define stroke? Oh, okay. Thanks, Christian, for participating. I really like that you're participating. Christian, yeah, Christian, your definition is not really the stroke itself, but it could happen after the stroke has occurred. Okay. Krista says a reaction from damage to the brain. Okay, that's not too bad, Krista. So let me help you along here and just give you an idea here. Okay. A stroke is literally a death of neurons. A stroke is a death of neurons. So, as Rebecca and Carissa are suggesting that, you could have neurons die because there is some kind of problem with the blood supply to the brain. That's a possibility. Okay. So a stroke is literally a death of neurons caused by many things, including disruption in the blood supply to the brain. And the point I'm making here is that with the definition of a neuron that we put into your notes, right, we said a neuron does not generally reproduce in the adult body. That's unfortunately all too true, because if you think about it, people that have strokes, a lot of times they have a very hard time rehabilitating themselves back to their pre-stroke level. Okay, so somebody that has a stroke might talk with a lisp the rest of their life. Somebody that has a stroke might not be quite as mobile as he or she was afterwards. They might saunter differently because their nervous system can't quite coordinate their skeletal muscle contractions as well as they did. I'll be frank with you. About 6-7 years ago, my mother-in-law had a stroke, and she's now wheelchair bound because of that event. Unfortunately, she had a very bad stroke. She didn't get medical care very rapidly because, well, she was scared. Okay. And so, long story short, a very capable person that could walk and run, do all the things we take for granted, is now in a wheelchair because of the stroke. Okay. A stroke is a death of neurons. And as you see from the definition, neurons, particularly in our adult bodies, do not generally reproduce. Okay. All right. So when we talk about neurons, we can talk about subcategories of neurons or subtypes of neurons. And, you know, if you were in a neurology or nervous system class where the entire focus of the class is, you would learn about many, many, many subtypes of neurons. I'm only going to tell you about three in this course, okay? So there are more subtypes than we're going to tell you about. So first we have sensory neurons. Sensory neurons detect changes in the internal or external environment that the body is in, right? You have sensory neurons embedded in the dermal layer of your skin, right? They detect temperature changes in the air, right? You have sensory neurons embedded in the wall of your aorta, which is the major artery coming off the heart. So every time the heart squeezes and pushes blood through it, that blood vessel expands, it opens up, it stretches. So there are sensory neurons that report information about the aorta stretching to the brain so that your brain is aware of what's happening at the heart. And in fact, that aortic stretching tells the brain information about your blood pressure status, okay? So sensory neurons detect changes in the internal or external environments of the body. We have motor neurons, which we've somewhat talked about here. Motor neurons deliver instructions from the central nervous system to the effector. That effector is going to be a muscle or a gland. So those two you kind of know about, you've had some experience with. There's a third category of neuron we'll share with you here. It's called an integrative neuron. Sometimes it's also called an interneuron. Okay, so an integrative or interneuron. These neurons help process information being received into the central nervous system and helps your brain make a decision about something. For example, maybe somebody walks into the room that you're sitting in and gives you a plate of food and says, here, eat it. And so you have to decide whether you're going to eat it. And think about what you would think about in terms of making that decision. In a very brief period of time, you would think about, well, am I hungry? Do I actually really want to eat? You would also think about the visual appearance of the food that was presented to you. Does it look appetizing? Does it look appealing? You might process a sense of smell. Does the food smell correct? Does it smell good? Okay, if it doesn't, maybe I don't want it. Maybe you would touch the food with your finger and say, is the food hot or cold? Okay, so there would be a lot of different pieces of information rumbling around in the anatomy of your brain that have to come together so that you can make a decision. The integrative neurons are neurons that are pulling pieces of information together from different anatomical subclusters of neurons in the brain so that your brain can make a decision. Yes, I'm going to eat this plate of food that was presented to me, or no, I'm not going to eat it. I'm not interested at this time, okay? So integrative neurons help bring together separate pieces of information in the brain to facilitate decision making. Okay. All right. And honestly, if we believe, when I say we, I mean science, we believe that there are more integrative neurons in your body than there are sensory or motor neurons. There's evidence to suggest that the most abundant, the most common type of neuron in your body is the integrative neuron, okay? Okay, you have more integrative neurons in your anatomy than other types of neurons. Okay, let's continue here. Number 2, there's another class of nervous system cell that you know about from your time studying chapter 4, and that is the neuroglial cell. A neuroglial cell is a cell of the nervous system that does not have the ability to generate an electrical signal, but can reproduce. So you see, if we compare the neuroglial cell to the neuron can create the electrical signal. Glial cell cannot, but a glial cell can reproduce and a neuron cannot. So let me ask you a question in the chat window. Here we go. Would you expect that 99 times out of 100 the cells in a brain tumor are glial cells or neurons? Okay. All right. Thanks, Sierra. Thanks, Christian. All right. Good job, folks. All right. It's just a matter of logic. Okay. You're absolutely right. By far, the majority of cells in the majority of brain tumors are going to be glial cells, because glial cells have the ability to reproduce. Neurons generally don't do it. Neuron may do it if they have a genetic abnormality, but 99 times out of 100, when someone is unfortunate enough to have a brain tumor, okay, those tumors would be typically known as glioblastomas. Glioblastomas, well, it's going to be a mass of overly reproduced glial cells. Something's gone wrong in the genetic program of the glial cell population of the brain that has caused them to inappropriately reproduce. Okay. All right. Honestly, in our course, we won't be telling you too much about glial cells, but I will say that the function of a glial cell is, generally speaking, to nurture, protect, and take care of neurons. That's generally what we think of as the major function of a glial cell. Okay, so in a silly little analogy, you might think of, a neuron as the spoiled, rich rock star who can't even take care of cleaning their own clothes unless they have hired a butler or nanny. Okay, so the neuron would be the rock star, and the butler or nanny would be the neuroglial cell. Okay. Now, I'll also say that science is really starting to discover other things about neuroglial cells that are starting to broaden our understanding of these different kinds of cells. Neuroglial cells, some subtypes of neuroglial cells definitely function as immune system cells, so they help defend the brain, defend the neurons from microorganisms that might want to invade the brain and cause harm. Okay, subsets of neuroglial cells do function as immune system defense cells. And I will say that some recent research is focusing a spotlight on neuroglial cells, and in the sense that if neuroglial cells are malfunctioning in certain ways, they may contribute to disease states, including various conditions that lead to chronic pain in the body. So if you know anybody that suffers chronic pain, a chronic pain condition would be something like fibromyalgia, okay? So anybody with certain chronic pain disorders, modern science is starting to think that neuroglial cells might be involved in maintaining these chronic pain states, okay? Okay. All right, folks. So there you have it. Neurons, neuroglial cells. Any questions? Okay. Another term we should know something about is the term nerve. Okay. So sometimes I ask students, what is a nerve? And you say, okay, well, if you're sitting there at home and thinking to yourself, wow, Dr. Allen is really getting on my last nerve. Fine, but tell me, what is it I'm getting on? I want to know what it is I'm getting on. Okay, folks, a nerve is a bundle of many, and many could be qualified by the numbers hundreds to thousands. A nerve is a bundle of hundreds to thousands of axons that are running parallel to each other, right? They're running next to each other, okay? A nerve is a bundle of hundreds to thousands of axons. So obviously the extensions of axons are off the neuron. A bundle of hundreds of thousands of axons from neurons that run parallel to each other. Okay. The connective tissue and blood vessels that are associated with those parallel bundles of axons would also typically be categorized as part of the nerve. Okay. All right, so a nerve is a bundle of axons and the associated connective tissue and blood supply of those axons. All of that together collectively is a nerve, okay? Typically, we just focus on the bundle of axons, right? But technically, there's some other stuff there. All right, so you know, and you will come to know through your study time in lab, that you have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that come out of the brain. Okay, and you have to know them for your future lab exam. Those are the 12 nerves we're asking you to be able to identify, okay? And you also have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come out of the spinal cord. Okay. Those 31 pairs of spinal nerves you are not responsible for in lab. You are not responsible for. Okay. All right, folks. Any thoughts, questions, problems? All right, so now we have some basic terminology defined. Now we're going to transition into a conversation about nervous tissue histology. We're going to go a little bit deeper here, folks. Okay, so in your textbook, there's section 12.2, which is titled Histology of Nervous Tissue. This is basically what I'm looking at. A good figure to look at is figure 12.2. Okay. Well, let's talk about, let's see here. Let's talk about, I'll do it this way. Let's talk about neurons first. Okay. And we'll talk about some things here. So take a look at figure 12.2. In my book, it's page 423. We have the cell body. Okay, the cell body contains the standard organelles of a typical eukaryotic cell that you've become accustomed to, including the nucleus of the neuron. This is the rounded portion of a neuron, which is comparable to an average eukaryotic cell, which includes the nucleus, mitochondria, Golgi complex, lysosomes, etc., etc. Okay. Now, here's when we're talking about cell bodies of neurons, there's some ideas that come up, and this came up in lab last time when we were talking about the anatomy. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that when you have a group, when you have a group of neuronal cell bodies, because we're talking about cell body right here in our notes, right? Cell body. When you have a cluster of cell bodies of neurons in the central nervous system, that group of cell bodies is called a nucleus. Okay, a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system is referred to as a nucleus. Okay, so you need to be very careful here, right? Because that term nucleus could mean the organelle inside one individual cell that contains the DNA, excuse me, or you could have it being the group of cells, the group of cell bodies in the central nervous system being a nucleus. Further, there's also a comparable term in the peripheral nervous system. A group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is referred to as a ganglion. Okay, sounds very ominous. Group of cell bodies in the PNS is referred to as a ganglion. Okay. So remember, when you're reading an exam question, you got to contextualize. What is the context of the question? If the context of a question is talking about one single cell, then the term nucleus refers to the organelle inside that cell where you have the DNA. But if the context of the question is talking about the central nervous system and about a cluster of cells that are organized as a group, then that term nucleus is referring to the cell bodies of that collective group of cells. All right, ganglion, not so much a problem because a ganglion is a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Let's continue. Please put some eyeballs on this anatomy in figure 12.2 as we go down the list. So cell body, you can see that in figure 12.2. We also have Nissl bodies. Nissl bodies, that phrase is a neuron-specific term for rough endoplasmic reticulum, right? You've learned about rough endoplasmic reticulum in chapter 3. So the rough endoplasmic reticulum of a neuron is called a Nissl body, okay? So you can appreciate that there are going to be ribosomes associated with the Nissl bodies, right? Okay, next. We have neurofibrils, okay? Neurofibrils, again, neurofibril in figure 12.2 is along the right side of the cell body there. It's a term along the right side. See if you can find it, neurofibril. Okay. Neurofibrils are part of the neuron's cytoskeleton. Okay. The neurofibrils are made of these protein chains called intermediate filaments. And intermediate filaments are themselves made of multiple proteins that interlock to build the chain. I'll list these things out, but I promise I'm not going to ask this on a test. Okay, some of the proteins you're going to find as part of the intermediate filaments, which make up the neurofibril, is keratin. Hey, that's a word we heard before, right? Keratin, remember from the keratinocytes of the epidermis. There's other proteins we haven't talked about, such as vimentin, desmin, peripherin, and lamin. Okay, I'm not going to test you on that, so don't worry about that. Made of intermediate filaments. The filaments are made of multiple interlocking proteins. Okay. Next, number 4, nerve fiber. Nerve fiber. Folks, a nerve fiber is simply a fancy way of referring to any kind of cytoplasmic extension that comes off the cell body. So basically, there's 2 types that you already know about, the dendrites and the axon. Okay. A nerve fiber is any extension off the cell body. All right. So that's going to break down to dendrites, which you already know. You realize that the purpose of dendrites is to receive information from other neurons. And an axon, typically we say axon because the standard in the field is that neurons typically have multiple dendrites, and most neurons have one axon. That's not always true. You can have neurons that have multiple axons. That does exist in your anatomy as well, but we don't typically describe it that way to students. Okay, axon sends information from a neuron to other cells, right? Other cells. That other cells could be another distant neuron, could be a muscle cell, right, at the neuromuscular junction, could be a glandular cell in some endocrine tissue that's going to end up releasing a hormone, right? So axon sends information from a neuron to other cells. Okay. Okay. Now, when we start talking about the axon, we need to draw your attention down. So I'm going to ask you to have a look at the axon of figure 12.2. The word axon is listed along the left-hand side of that picture. So look at the axon. And then once you identify the axon term, I want you to scan your eyes up and start to approach the cell body. And what I want you to look for is a phrase called the axon hillock. Axon hillock, Hillock. All right. So let's see here. I think I'll do it this way next. Okay, so the axon hillock. The axon hillock is the portion of the axon that immediately extends off the cell body. And under most normal physiological circumstances, the axon hillock is going to be where the electrical signal is generated by a neuron. So the axon hillock is usually the starting place of a nerve impulse for that cell, okay? Is the typical starting location for nerve impulse generation. While you don't really need to know too much about this yet, you know, a nerve impulse is basically begun when sodium ions cross the plasma membrane of a cell and enter the cytoplasm. The motion of the sodium ions into the cytoplasm is known as depolarization. Okay, we'll talk about it probably next lecture, actually. But long story short, the reason the axon hillock is the starting location for the electrical signal is because in that stretch of anatomy that we're calling the axon hillock, there is an unusually high number of sodium ion channels that can enable the sodium to come across the membrane into the cell. And so for that reason, that section of the anatomy allows more sodium in to actually trigger the electrical signal, okay? There it is in your notes. This region of anatomy has a high number of sodium ion channels to enable nerve impulse creation. Okay. We will also put in something that we defined in chapter 10, but hey, why not do it again? It will reinforce your knowledge. Synaptic end bulbs. Okay, you can see that lower left corner, figure 12.2. These are located at the very end of the axon and what is known as the axon terminals. You notice that in figure 12.2, you have one axon, but if you trace the axon down towards the bottom of the image, the end of the axon forks out in many branches, right? Many branches. So you could have multiple extensions of the axon reaching multiple cells or multiple, could be reaching multiple muscles of a fascicle, so that all the muscle cells of the fascicle could coordinately contract at the same time. Synaptic end bulbs, the very end of axon terminals that contain synaptic vesicles with neurotransmitter inside, okay? All right, folks. Folks, do you have any questions right now? Let's continue. Okay, so that was just a little bit about neurons. What I want to do next is tell you a little bit about neuroglia. And so neuroglia will cause us to skip to figure 12.6. Let's take a look at figure 12.6. Okay. So when we talk about neuroglia, we're going to have to break these. We're going to have to break the topic of neuroglia down into neuroglia that are part of the central nervous system versus neuroglia that are part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so neuroglia of the central nervous system, that will be the topic of figure 12.6. Okay, so we're going to list several of them out at this time. All right, so first we have a type of neuroglial cell called an astrocyte. An astrocyte, okay, so just put an eyeball on that. Okay, you can see for yourself that there are actually different kinds of astrocytes. Okay, so in figure 12.6, go down the left column of terms. Don't you see a fibrous astrocyte? Don't you see a protoplasmic astrocyte? Again, on the right side of the image, you see an additional protoplasmic astrocyte. Okay, so there are astrocytes, which are a type of neuroglial cell in the central nervous system. And I'm not going to ask you to know the different subtypes of astrocytes, but I'm going to make a couple statements about astrocytes. In the central nervous system, astrocytes help maintain the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. You may know that the blood-brain barrier, we haven't talked about it in our course. You're going to get it in A&P2. But unfortunately, some topics we talk about in A&P1 connect with A&P2 ideas. The blood-brain barrier is a network of capillaries in the brain that actually act as a filtration network to prevent harmful materials from entering the cerebrospinal fluid and gaining access to the neurons of the brain and potentially harming them. Okay, so in the central nervous system, astrocytes help maintain the integrity of the blood-brain barrier to prevent harmful substances from damaging neurons. Okay. You'll learn more about the blood-brain barrier in A&P2. Suffice it to say, when I define the blood-brain barrier to you here, it sounds like a really good idea, right? Yeah, we should have some kind of defense that protects our brain cells from bad things in the bloodstream. Sounds like a great idea. It is a great idea. Blood-brain barrier is a great idea. But sometimes, like everything, there's a duality to things, right? There's a good and a bad. The blood-brain barrier is very helpful. It protects us. But the blood-brain barrier does make it more difficult to treat infections in the brain, because when we put medications in the bloodstream that we want to get across the barrier into the brain to help destroy microorganisms that might be harming the brain, a lot of times the blood-brain barrier prevents those substances from penetrating into the brain tissue, and it makes it harder to treat disease. So there's a good aspect to it and a bad aspect to it. Okay, let's continue. In embryos, okay, so the unborn child, astrocytes help the developing brain tissue form connections between neurons called synapses. I suspect the reason your textbook is saying it the way it does say it, your textbook says in embryos, astrocytes do this, is because some scientific study observed this in embryonic tissue. I would be very surprised if astrocytes did not also help the adult brain form synaptic connections. I suspect it does. Okay. And finally, astrocytes help maintain a healthy and chemical environment around the neuron so that the neuron is capable of generating an electrical signal. Okay. All right. And finally, there is some evidence to suggest that, thinking with bullet point letter B there in the embryo, since astrocytes do play a role in forming synaptic connections, at least as documented in the embryo, there is some reason to suggest that astrocytes do play a role in helping our brains learn a new task. So for example, if you were just starting out learning how to play the piano, right, that would be really hard and it would take some time, take some practice. But if you've ever tried to do something hard, like play an instrument, you realize over time, you train, you go to sleep, you wake up, and if you keep doing this a number of times, all of a sudden you kind of wake up and things start to seem a little bit easier and a little bit easier and a little bit easier. And finally, you can play the piano, right, if you stick to it. So may play a role in learning and memory. Okay, folks, I see my time. I've gotten a little crazy here. I'm out of time. I'm going to stop. Okay, I'm going to stop. We'll pick up here next Thursday after your exam. So Tuesday coming up, this coming Tuesday, no lecture. Please log in to class marker at 8 a.m. Take your exam. Good luck. I know you've been working hard. And remember, lab on Tuesday will start at 9:45.